Every week we like to share a fun fact about Tim, and what we'll share tonight is that he's a very musical person, and in college he was actually the first chair trumpet in his orchestra, but he might say that it was because there was no trumpet majors at his college, a small university, but yes, he played many instruments, including trumpet. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Keller.
Hi, glad you're here. The first week in this series, we said, and this is kind of the premise for everything else we're doing, the first week in this series we said that there's no demonstrable, totally slam dunk way to prove that there is a God, but it's also impossible to totally demonstrably prove that there isn't a God. So, for example, many atheists would say, well, matter, the material world, generated itself. Matter generated itself. Or, they'll say, matter has always existed beginninglessly without cause, even though there's nothing in this material world we know like that. So then the question comes, how would you prove that? What experimental design would you use to prove a hypothesis like that? And the answer is you can't, because it's not a scientific hypothesis. It's a statement of faith. And to live life as if there is no God or on the basis of no God is an act of faith. So what we said that first week was secularism is not the absence of belief, it's a different set of beliefs. And secularism, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam can't demonstrably prove their set of beliefs to everyone. But that doesn't mean they can't be compared. That doesn't mean we can't rationally interrogate and weigh sets of beliefs. And that's what we're doing. You say, well, how do you do that? Well, one is you ask whether or not the belief system is consistent with experience. You can also ask if the belief system is consistent with evidence. So what do you mean by consistent with experience? Well, is it livable? It's one thing to say, I believe this, but when you actually live it out, do you find yourself smuggling in values from other systems that are not in yours? I mean, in other words, is it livable? Is it consistent with experience, our experience? And then, of course, is it consistent with evidence? There are arguments. They can't prove this completely. There's arguments for and against Jesus and God and so on. And what we're going to do in this series is weigh these things. Now, right now, last week, this week, next week, we're going to look at a number of things. We're actually in the livability way of comparing belief systems. We're looking at whether they fit our experience, they're consistent. And because everybody, regardless of what you believe, you've got to have the same things. You have to have a meaning in life that can help you face suffering. You've got to have a satisfaction in life that's deep enough to get you through the ups and downs of circumstances. You have to have an identity that's strong enough to sustain you through the ups and downs of your own performance. You've got to have a basis for making moral judgments and doing justice that doesn't turn you into an oppressor yourself. And you've got to have a hope that enables you to face the future. So everybody has to have those things to live, and every set of beliefs gives you a working theory of how to get those things, and we're going to compare those working theories. And we're going to compare them. And of course, even though I'm going to be trying, I hope you believe, trying to be as fair as I can to all the different belief systems, I am here to say that arguably Christianity has unequaled resources for those things. Now tonight we're going to look at the pursuit of happiness or satisfaction or contentment or fulfillment. And to a great degree, everything you're doing in life is a pursuit of happiness, satisfaction, contentment, fulfillment. Should we search for it? And then, why do we search for it? How do we search for it? And where should we search for it? So let's start by asking the question, should we even search for it? Now, I'm going to be brief on this, but I need to bring out, honestly, the fact that there are some people who say that the search for happiness, the quest for happiness, really is a sort of a non-issue because most people are happy. So, for example, Julian Baggini and Tom Nagel, both philosophers, they public intellectuals, they write a lot, and I've been very helped by both of their writings. But what I think is interesting is they both make the same argument that they look at things that say most people say they're happy most of the time. There's a lot of surveys like that. In fact, almost all the surveys that you take when you ask people, are you happy? Most people say they're happy most of the time. And Tom Nagel and Julian Bikini say, and since nobody expects to be happy all the time anyway, what's the big deal? Most people say they're happy most of the time. Nobody expects to be happy. It's a non-issue. There's no quest for happiness. Now, Terry Eagleton, who's a British literary critic and a very funny writer, what he says is the depth of our problem is masked by the very word happiness. So what he would say is that, let's not use the word happy. In fact, what he says is, he says the problem is when you ask people to be happy, he says, happiness is, quote, a feeble, holiday camp sort of word evocative of manic grins and cavorting about. And then he goes and says, most people, if you ask them, are they happy? They, in most people's minds, happy means being okay to having some fun. So when you ask people if they're happy, they say, okay. But then he says, why don't you listen more carefully? Say, let's listen. Do you see how angry everybody is? You see it on social media. You see it in the media. Do you see how angry people are? There's always these explosions of rage and outrage, sometimes in violence, certainly, like I said, on social media. Or look at the depression and the suicide rates. A couple of years ago, I mean, everybody knows, for example, that at colleges there's like 3, 4, 5 times more people going to the mental health services talking about depression, anxiety, and suicide. A couple of years ago, there was an article in the New York Times saying, maybe it's just because younger people are more willing to go get help. But recently, a very awful set of stats came out. The National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which is run by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, what they do is they survey 600,000 people. Now, there's not just people going to mental, seeking help, 600,000 people. Between 2009 and 2017, I'm just being very selective, reports of depression doubled for people in their early 20s, and suicide attempts doubled for people in their early 20s. And as a society, we aren't happy. We are not finding a depth of satisfaction. We are not. And we are maybe in denial about the depth of our discontent. But that word depth, I've used the word deep a couple times, and here's why I wanted to talk about that. If Kathy was here, she'll smile if I say this, and that is my wife, Kathy. She knows that I really would love a fireplace in my home. For the last 35 years, I have not had a fireplace in my home. And she also knows it's enough of a sustained desire that I bring it up all the time. She knows that if I got a fireplace, if I lived in a place with a fireplace, I'd be incredibly delighted. But the fact of the matter is, if my work is going well, if my family's going well, my relationships are going well, the lack of a fireplace does not really overshadow my life. Because when your more fundamental desires are satisfied, then frustration of more superficial desires is something you can manage. Got that? When the more fundamental desires are fulfilled, the more you can handle frustration of the more superficial desires. But that's why we search. Because what happens if you go after the kind of things that should be as fundamental as there can be? In other words, the things that really should make you really, really, really sustained, deeply happy. Like your career. What if you get far more successful than you ever thought you would be? Like love, like family, like relationships. What if they're all fine and you're still not satisfied? Jonathan Haidt, social psychologist, wrote a book that he's not well known for, but it's a terrific little book called The Happiness Hypothesis. And he looks at the history of Western thought and Eastern thought to see how people approached happiness. And he says the surprising, overwhelming consensus of the philosophers and the sages of ancient times, East, West, Greek, Roman, Chinese, Indian, the overwhelming consensus of the sages and philosophers of ancient times was that even if all the deepest desires for worldly success and love are fulfilled, it won't be enough. You will still be dissatisfied. You will still be deeply dissatisfied. And therefore, it seems like we're searching for something deeper still than all the things that we would ordinarily think, yeah, that should be enough, that should be enough. There was a Roman poet named Horace, you may have heard of him. He had the good fortune of really befriending a great guy, and they became close friends, and after a while, his friend became Caesar Augustus. That's hitting the jackpot. So, one of his best friends becomes the emperor of the world. Not bad. And Horace happened to be a good poet as well. And so, in the middle of his career, he had reached the heights. He was the leading intellectual light in the Roman world, the leading artist. He had wealth. He lived in a palace. He had fame. He had fortune. He was at the apex. And Horace said, no one lives content. No one lives content. Think of who's saying that. He's saying, I've been to the top and there's nothing there. A lot more funny and still, I think, unsurpassable expression of this ancient truth was written by Cynthia Heimel, who wrote in the Village Voice years ago. She had a column in the Village Voice. And she had known, in the 1980s, she knew a couple of people who became big movie stars. And I'm leaving their names out just because it's a little bit of cruel, but you know who they are too. Except if I told you the names, but I won't. And she said she knew some movie stars who she had known them when one was working behind the cosmetic counter at Macy's and one was a bouncer at a club in the village. And then they became incredibly famous, big celebrities, movie stars. And she noticed as they got big and successful, they were, if anything, more unhappy, more angry, and more mean than they'd ever been. And this is what she wrote. She said that giant thing they were striving for, that fame thing that was going to make everything okay, that was going to make their lives bearable, that was going to provide them with personal fulfillment and happiness, had happened, and they were still them. The disillusionment turned them howling and insufferable. And then she adds, and it's a remarkable statement, she says, I think if God really wants to play a rotten practical joke on you, he grants your deepest wish and then giggles merrily as you suddenly realize you want to kill yourself. And that's very cheeky and very funny, but it's exactly what Jonathan Haidt says was the consensus of all the philosophers and sages of the ancient times. C.S. Lewis puts it awfully well, not quite as funny, of course, but extremely clearly in his famous BBC radio talk. And this actually distills everything that Jonathan Haidt would tell you if you went to Cicero or if you went to Confucius or you went to anybody in the ancient times. Lewis summarizes the thesis like this. Most people, if they really learned how to look into their own hearts, would know that they do want and want acutely something that cannot be had in this world. There are all sorts of things in this world that offer to give it to you, but they never keep their promise. The longings which arise in us when we first fall in love, or first think of some foreign country, or first take up some subject that excites us, or first start a new job, are longings which no marriage, no travel, no learning can really satisfy. I am not speaking of what would ordinarily be called unsuccessful marriages or trips or so on. I'm speaking of the very best possible ones, but there's always something we grasp at in the first moment of longing that just fades away in the reality. The spouse may be a good spouse. The scenery has been excellent. It's turned out to be a wonderful job, but it has evaded us. There's something deeper. Here's the fireplace. Here's career and romance and family and all the things you think should be enough. There's something below that. There's something deeper. There is something deeper, as deeper than success or family. Then success or family is deeper than a fireplace. What is it? Lewis just calls it it. There's something deeper still, and we're after. And the greatest success doesn't give it to us. The greatest family, the greatest romance, the greatest accomplishment doesn't give it to us. You know, the classic U2 album, in Joshua Tree, that song, it's all about that. You know, Bono sings, I've climbed the highest mountain, I've scaled the city walls, I've kissed honey lips, is that it? But I still haven't found what I'm looking for. That's the same thing. Now, here's the question. Once you come up against this fact that you know, here's the superficial desires and here's the deeper desires, and you fulfill those deeper desires, and there's something deeper still that we don't even know what it is, but it's just these things are not giving us satisfaction. What do you do then? What do you do when you realize all those things won't satisfy? And Jonathan Haidt, that's what's so great about this book. He says basically there's two ways to respond. He calls it the ancient way and the modern way. Now he says the ancient way, and it is remarkable, he talks about the fact that the East and West were pretty much the same. The ancient way, here's how he responded to this fact. The ancient way was to say, it is not out there. It's an illusion that there's an it. There's an illusion that there's anything out there that will ever satisfy you. So stop searching for it and suppress your desires for it. That's the ancient way. So actually, I think I might have even I quoted this last week. So ancient Greek philosophers would say you detach your heart from anything. So Epictetus, who was a Greek philosopher, this is a quote. Last week I didn't have the quote. He says, "What harm is there that while you're kissing your child in the morning, you should murmur softly to yourself, 'Tomorrow you will die'?" And what Epictetus is trying to say is emotional self-control, detach, be kind to your child, but don't love your child too much. Don't get too emotionally attached, because this world is like a forest, and every tree is coming down, so don't make your nest in any of them. Now, Buddhism, as some of you know, is actually based on this idea that the idea you can find satisfaction, in the things of this world, that is a total illusion. In fact, that's what Buddhism is all about. All your suffering, all your discontent, all your problems come from the idea that this world can satisfy you. What you need to do is realize that the world is due. That's a very famous Buddhist metaphor. The world is due, D-E-W. And that you are all dewdrops, temporarily individuals, and eventually when we die, we go back into the ocean. Dewdrops go into the ocean, and we still exist, but we're not individuals, we're not personal. And so it's an illusion that you're an individual. It's an illusion that you're a person. Love is an illusion. We're all one. Whether you're poor or you're rich, doesn't matter. It's all kind of an illusion. We're all one. And so Buddhist meditation tries to get past that. But it's the same thing as Epictetus. Basically, what you have to say is, it is not out there. And you need to suppress your desires. That's the ancient way. But the modern way, Jonathan Haidt says, is exactly the opposite. The ancient way is, it is not out there. And the modern way is, happiness is out there. And you need to pursue your passion. And you don't let anybody tell you that you can't do it. You figure out what will make you happy. You decide what that is, and then you don't let anybody stand in your way. But, as Jonathan Haidt says, what happens is the ancients weren't crazy. Because when modern people start to get some of these accomplishments, they are surprised they've begun to realize what everybody else does eventually. And that is, it's not that satisfying. It's disappointing. It's much more disappointing than I thought it would be. Then what happens? And there's 4 things that can happen to modern people, actually a 5th. I'll talk to you about that in a way. But there's mainly 4 things that can happen. Because modern people still are sure it's out there, and we have to pursue our passion. So when they start to get disappointed, what happens? There's 4 things that can happen. One is they can become perpetually frantic. You know why? Some people, when they realize they're being disappointed, they haven't found it, but they think it is still out there, they blame the things. They have a good job, they have a good spouse, but I'm not happy. It must be the job and the spouse. I need a better job, I need a better spouse, and then I'll be happy. Now, that's partly true in the sense that all jobs and all spouses have flaws. And then there's a certain amount of warrant to saying, well, there must be something wrong with these things. But the perpetually frantic person is someone who just keeps working and it's perpetually driven, because if I'm not happy, it's because I need more money, I need a better job, I need a better spouse, I need a better body, I need these things. And so the perpetually frantic blame the things. But of course, they become exhausted with their franticness and their pursuit of them. Secondly, you can become perpetually angry. Perpetually angry people believe it is out there, but I don't have it. So they don't blame the things, they blame social forces. They say the reason I'm unhappy is that there's groups or people or social structures out there that are keeping me from being everything I should be, keeping me from being free to pursue everything. And so these people become activists. They don't blame the things, they blame society, they blame social forces, and they become activists. And again, there's some truth in it because there really are unjust social forces. But in light of history, what you want to say is, hey, there's nothing wrong with seeking justice and freedom, but guess what? When you get it, if you get it, you're going to be as unhappy as the free people are. You can look at them and, oh, they must be happy. They're not happy. So you can be perpetually frantic because you blame the things. You can be perpetually angry because you blame social forces. Thirdly, you can be perpetually self-hating because you blame yourself. One of the reasons you look around, I'm not happy, it must be my fault. It must be my fault. It must be something I'm doing. I must be a failure. It's out there, and if I don't have it, it's something wrong with me. And of course, again, there's some truth to that. There's always something wrong with you, whoever you are. But of course, if that's how you deal with it, if you say, it's out there, I don't have it, you're not blaming the things, you're not blaming social forces, you're blaming yourself, you are in an incredibly vulnerable position. Of course it leads to depression. Of course it leads to addiction. Of course it can lead to suicide. It's very, very bad and very dangerous. But there's a fourth way you can go, and that is you can get deeply cynical. In C.S. Lewis's famous radio talk that I've already quoted, and I'll quote it again in a second, he believes that one of the things that happens when you realize that these most fundamental things in life can't give you satisfaction, one of the things you do is you become what he called the disillusioned sensible person. The disillusioned sensible person who says, well, by the time you get to my age, you've given up chasing the rainbow's end. And so, Lewis says, the disillusioned sensible people repress that part of themselves that they say used to cry for the moon. Now, you say, oh, well, they're just being like the Buddhists or like the Greek philosophers. No. Because I think what Lewis hints at, and what I'm going to tell you, is if you start out as a modern person, sure that it is out there, and you finally, after years, realize it's not there. Nobody will be happy. It's just stop trying to be happy. Just forget all about it. You're going to be a lot more bitter. There's going to be a lot more bitterness than the ancients had. And here's the trouble with it. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger at one point says the difference between between a human being and an animal is animals are quite happy just to survive, and human beings never are. He goes on and he says, human beings want joy, they want meaning, they want fulfillment, and if you decide all I can do is survive and not try to look for joy and fulfillment, if you kill the part of the heart that wants that, so you won't be disappointed, so you won't continue to be disappointed. You get hard and cynical, you kill that part of your heart. You don't get your hopes up. You're killing the part of your heart that makes you different from animals. You're dehumanizing yourself, you're hardening yourself. And so there you are. Once you come up against this reality that your deepest desires for happiness and satisfaction cannot be fulfilled by anything in this world, you either can take the ancient way, which I think detaches you, basically tamps down love, it admits it, can harden you, or else the modern way, which is you're perpetually exhausted with franticness, or exhausted with depression, or exhausted with anger. Is there another way? Yeah. It's the Christian way, and I would be more specific than that. I would like you to look for a moment with me at both the life and the teaching of St. Augustine, one of the greatest thinkers in history of the world, and certainly one of the greatest thinkers in the history of the church. Now, St. Augustine was an African born and raised in Africa, North Africa, of course, and he was probably a Berber, meaning he was probably dark-skinned. And St. Augustine was he was in a marginal part of the Roman Empire, and he was a marginal race, but he longed to be on the inside because he was brilliant. He was brilliant. And he so much wanted to go to the big city and to get educated and to be admitted into the elite circles of the intellectual circles. And he also wanted to have sex. So he moved to Carthage. And there in Carthage, which was the most cosmopolitan possible city in Africa, he did get educated. He started to get into the intellectual world, and he started to experience sexual love. But he was pretty unhappy because Carthage, in the end, he decided this was a backwater. This isn't happy. It's not making me happy. I'm disappointed. So he found a way to get to Rome, and he set up as a tutor in Rome. But when he got to Rome, he was still unhappy, and he wasn't content, even though he was closer to power, and he was moving on up, and he was meeting more powerful people, but he still found an emptiness inside. So then he finally figured out a way to get to Milan, which Milan was the seat of the Roman Empire, and he actually, where the emperors was, and he actually began to enter into the administration of the imperial administration. And he thought, I've reached the top, and it still wasn't enough. And he started to experience this disillusionment, like, I'm getting to the top, and I mean, there's nothing here. And then he read a book by Cicero called Hortensius. We actually, the only reason we even know about it, or what we know about it, comes from Augustine because it's been lost. But basically, the book said, you're never going to, it was Cicero, it was one of the ancient philosophers, and Cicero said, you know what, you're never going to be happy. Sex isn't going to do it, family's not going to do it, success isn't going to do it, intellectual attainment's not going to do it. You're never going to find pleasure and joy in success, and therefore, turn to philosophy, get philosophical. And so Augustine started going to philosophy, but eventually it led him to Christianity. And he finally realized something. Now, here's the famous quote. Here's two quotes. One you haven't heard before, but one you may have. He said, my mistake, I realized, consisted in this, that I sought pleasure and sublimity, not in God, but in creation, in myself and other created beings. And then more famously, he said, to God, to worship you is the deepest desire of humanity, for you have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest and fulfillment in you. You have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless till it finds its rest and fulfillment in you. Now, here's the revolutionary thing that Augustine saw. First of all, he said, the ancient philosophers and sages are wrong. It is out there. There is something that will satisfy the deepest recesses of your heart. But, he said, he had been wrong, and of course, all modern people are wrong, because it is not something you can find within inside the confines of the world. What is it? He says, what we're after, the deepest need of our heart, is to love and be loved by God, who made us for that. He made us for himself. He made us for that. And therefore, our hearts are restless till they find a rest in thee. There's an emptiness, there's a cavity that only God could possibly fulfill. And if you love anything more than God, we know this at the addiction level. Addiction to substances, we all know this. When you start to get addicted to a substance, the substance gives you a high at first, but it wears off. And then you need more of the substance to get the same high, and then that begins to wear off. And then you need more and more, so you become enslaved and increasingly empty. But what Augustine saw was everything is actually like that. If you love anything more than God, the very same spiral starts. It starts off seeming like it's going to give you a high, and then it wears off, then you need more, and then you need more, and then you need more, until you become absolutely empty and addicted. And he says that's the answer. The answer is not that you should love your little boy less, like Epictetus says, but you should love God more and enjoy the love of God more. Don't love your child less, don't love your career less, love God more in relationship to your child, and then The child and the career you will no longer be seeking to have those things do the same work in your heart that only God can do. And so you don't love them less. If you love God more and you rest more in God's love, those things you no longer look to them to do work in your heart that only God can do, and therefore the franticness and the anger and or the depression starts to diminish. You're not loving those things less. You're not less engaged. You're not doing the Stoic thing, the Buddhist thing. You're not doing the ancient thing. You attach your heart, you love them, but because God has a supremacy in your life, and that's what you're created for, that's the Augustinian theology, philosophy, then when you love God more, you love everything else better. Look, let me just get down. If I don't love God more than I love Kathy, I love Kathy terribly because I crush her with my expectations. I can't take her criticism. I can't take it if she fails me in any way. Only if I love God more than I love Kathy will I actually stop trying to make Kathy do things that only God can do for me. And I love Kathy better. I love her more freely. That's Augustinianism. That's Christianity. And that's the gospel. And that's not only an existential, but it's also actually a rational argument for the truth of Christianity. C.S. Lewis puts it like this. This is his, you might say this is his conclusion of this chapter I've been quoting. He says, I'll do it slowly because it's a rational argument. He says, so ducklings are born wanting to swim. Ooh, there's such a thing as water. Babies are born wanting to suck. There's such a thing as milk. And if I find in myself, a longing which this world cannot meet, then it probably means I was made for another world. See, that's both a rational and an existential argument for Christianity fitting our experience. Now, you might say, how does that actually work? You say, this sounds really interesting, but how does that actually work? So let's conclude by telling you 3 ways. I'm not proving Christianity here. I'm telling you how it works, how it actually gives you something I don't think the ancient way, the modern way, any other religion, secularism, they just can't give you. So I'm not trying to prove it. I'm just trying to show, if you believe it, here's how it works. 3 things to tell you about how it works. Number 1, you'll never be happy if you go to God to make you happy. That's the first thing. And I'm being Augustinian here. You say, what do you mean? Well, what if you say, and you might, and by the way, we're going to go upstairs and talk afterwards, and so I'm just going to try to say, please don't come up to me and say this, because I'll say, I told you not to say that. But actually, I'll be nice anyway, no matter what. Because for all I know, you might have just, I'm not the, you might be snoozing right now and missing what I'm about to say. But you can't go to God and say, oh, okay, if I love God, I'll be happy. Great, okay, let me love God so I'll be happy. That's not loving God. That's using God. What if somebody came to you and said, I want to be your friend? Oh, really? Yeah, because you can open doors for me and you can meet people and get me jobs and, help me in all kinds of ways. And you say, I don't feel like a friend, I feel like a tool. In other words, you're not loving me, because loving a person means loving them for who they are, not what they can do for you. Otherwise, it's just an instrument. You realize that. And so the first principle of this, if Augustine is right, and I believe he is, that the only way that you are ever going to find anything like satisfaction is if your loves are reordered. So you don't love certain things less, but that you reorder them so that you love God more and you rest in God's love more. So that your loves are reordered. If that's true, the only way for your loves to be reordered is to love God, and you can't go to him to make you happy. The only way you ever will be happy is if you go to him just because you love him. And then you'll be happy, only as a byproduct. Aim at heaven and you'll get earth thrown in. Aim at earth and you'll get neither. So that's the first idea. Keep that in mind. The second, though, is how does it actually work? And here's where Christianity has a leg up on other monotheistic religions. With all due respect, hat in my hand here. If somebody says to me, how can you love God? I mean, how do I just say, okay, I've got to love God. I buy the theory, I got to love God. How does that work? I'm trying. It doesn't work that way. I don't know how you can love an abstraction. I don't know, I can describe God. There is God in heaven, and he created you, and he's this and he's that. Is that going to make you love? No. Where Christianity has a leg up on all other religions is Christianity says that God came to earth in the form of Jesus Christ and died for us and saved us at infinite cost. Now, again, I told you, I'm not here to explain all that and prove it. I'm trying to tell you how it works. One of the best ways to do that is tell you a story. This is a story about one of the czars of old Russia before the communist revolution. I haven't been able to track it down, but it's a helpful illustration. So the story goes like this. The Russian czar had a friend. And this friend, dear friend, and this friend was dying of something. And this friend came the czar came to see him, and he said, would you please raise my son? My son is only 8 years old or something like that. And and my wife is dead, so would you please, that would be a great thing for you to do. And the czar says, I am your friend, you are my friend, and I will do that. So the man dies, and the czar adopts the boy, raises him up, loves him, gives him a great life, gives him a great education, and he goes into the army, and he gets up into a higher rank, and he becomes an administrator of a particular regiment. But he gets into gambling. And he keeps it a secret, but as the gambling debts accrue, he starts to have to embezzle army funds, regiment funds, to make good his debts, and it's getting worse, and it's getting worse. And one night, he looks at the books, and he realizes the jig is up. And there's absolutely no way he's not going to be found out. And he says, the shame and the dishonor will be too much. I'm going to have to kill myself. So he gets out a revolver, and he also gets out something to drink, some alcohol, because he wants to get his nerve up. So he drinks and drinks to get his nerve up, and he drinks too much, and he passes out. Now, this particular czar, the story goes, was a czar not unlike Henry V, by the way, in the Shakespeare play, who sometimes would dress up as an enlisted man, dress up as a corporal, as a poor man, disguise himself, and go out amongst his troops to see what the morale was like. Basically, go out amongst the people and see what was like. So he was in disguise, and he was moving around the camp, and he comes into the tent, and he sees his adopted son, and he sees him passed out, and he sees the gun, and he sees the open books, and he looks at it, and he realizes everything that happened. And when the young man wakes up, there is a note that says, I, the czar, will make good this debt for my own personal wealth. I am good for this entire debt. And it was signed, and his insignia was on it. And the young man said, the czar has seen me, and he's seen everything, and he knows what I've done, and he still loved me. Not only that, he's saving me at infinite cost to himself, his own honor, and also financial. Now, see, that actually is basically the Christian gospel. God created us, and we owe him everything, but we've turned away from him. And now God has come down in the form of Jesus Christ, and as it was, he's become one of us. He's come out among us, and he's looked into our hearts, and he's seen everything that's there. And he went to the cross to pay the debt. Again, I'm not explaining all this. I'm just telling you how it operates. And if you believe that and you see what he did for you, how precious we must be to him, then that makes him precious to you. If you see how precious we are to him and what he was willing to do for us, that begins to make him precious to you. You're starting to love. It evokes love. I don't know any other way to do it. But that's how it begins. And here's the last point. So the first point is you can't go to God to make you happy. You have to go to God to love him for what he has done, or otherwise you won't be happy. Secondly, you have to see that how the love of God is evoked in your heart by looking at what he did in Jesus Christ. That's how the Christian thing works. Here's one last thing. The love of Christ, God, that you experience in this life is always partial, but it's sufficient. It is never enough. It doesn't completely satisfy you. There are moments of incredible joy, but they are nothing but moments. And yet, even the very hope of it and the experience of it and the taste of it is what sustains you. It's always partial, but it's sufficient. So that's it. And at this point, I'm just trying to show you that there are things that that Christianity gives you as a way of finding that satisfaction, I think, do a better job of dealing with our actual experience and our actual need than any other particular source of, any other set of beliefs. So I'm going to ask Susan to come up here and start to take your questions, and we'll spend some time on that.
All right, so now to the questions for you. I thought this was a very interesting one, and one I'm wondering myself. Tim, is the pursuit of happiness a first world privilege?
A personal privilege?
A first world privilege.
Oh, yeah. No, that is a great question. I don't know to what degree I totally buy Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There is no doubt that if you're desperately hungry and you don't know where your next meal is going to come from, in some ways you don't think that much about how do I live a fulfilling life, and you're not caring about your career or anything else. But no, it's not a first world privilege. Let me give you an example. In Mark chapter 2 of the New Testament, it happens in Matthew and Luke too. In Mark chapter 2, there's a story about a man who's paralyzed. He's a paralytic. And Jesus, of course, is a miracle worker, so his friends bring him on a cot. They can't get into the house where Jesus is speaking because of the crowd. They pull apart the roof, and they lower him, pretty dramatic, to get their friend who's paralyzed to Jesus. Jesus walks over to him and says, "My son, your sins are forgiven." And if you stop and think about it, you realize how strange that is. I would imagine that the paralytic is sitting there saying, "Excuse me, you think I got a bigger problem than that right now? I mean, like, what are you talking about? That's not what I came for. I've got a more serious problem." And Jesus, in a way, is saying, "No, you don't." It's almost like Jesus is saying, you probably think that if only you could walk, then you'd be happy. But guess what? There's a whole lot of people running around here who are walking fine, and they're not happy either. And therefore, even though Jesus, of course, is going to heal him, by the way, in the story, he does heal him. But he's trying to say is, you have to realize if I heal you, that in no way actually solves your deeper problems. There's a deeper need you've got, and I'm dealing with it now by talking about your spiritual relationship with me. So that's, by the way, that's not a first world. That's obviously a time in history when people were not comfortable, etc. So I would say a paralyzed person who's having a terrible life could easily say, if only I could walk, I'd be happy. A hungry person could say, if I just had 3 meals a day, I'd be happy. And the answer of the ages is, no, you won't be. So I wouldn't go so far as to say it's really just a first world thing, in spite of the fact that it's possible you could make the case that the more affluent a society is, the more unhappy people are. And here's the reason why. Remember, Cynthia Heimel said that these two people that she knew who, when they were struggling artists, and then they became famous, and then they became even more unhappy. Why? Because when you're on your way up, you still can live in the illusion that if I get up there, I'll be happy. And it keeps you from realizing how discontent you are. It's the people who actually get up there that very often are the most despairing, because they spent all their life sure that if only this or that happened, then I'd be happy. When they get there, everything's right, and they're not. So you could make the argument that the more affluent societies, people are less happy than in the less affluent societies, but everybody's got the same problem.
You quoted Augustine. You said the quote, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." Someone is asking, though, couldn't that quote or that argument be made for any religion, not just Christianity, or not only Christianity?
Well, I try to say, yeah. I mean, in fact, all the monotheistic religions, I mean, obviously Buddhism, even Hinduism, they're not looking at God the same way. They don't see God as a personal being who loves, right? So when Augustine tries to say, our hearts are restless till we know your love, that would only work for monotheistic religions who believe in a personal God who loves, not Eastern religions who don't. And I was just trying to say, yeah, it would work for other monotheistic religions in theory. I tried to show you why I just can't love a God up in the heavens. I mean, I'm just telling you, it's very hard. It would be very abstract. It's the Christian message of what God has done for us in Christ that is very, very moving and makes it, I think, frankly, motivationally, psychologically, it's an enormous advantage for having that kind of divine love or love of God that reorders your heart. So, yeah, yes, but I still say Christianity is by far the best way to accomplish that.
I really like this question. It said that you said Christians should love God more than we love anyone, even our partners.
Yeah.
As a non-religious person, that makes me feel jealous of God. How can I reconcile my Christian partner loving God more than she loves me?
Oh. Yeah. I would hope that, listen, that makes superficial sense. But when I told you, maybe you don't believe me. I try to say, I love my wife better when I love God more than her. I love God more than I love her. And I try to explain a couple of reasons why. I would rather not get any more specific than I have. But the fact is, if you love your spouse more than anything in the world, well, there's 3 or 4 things I could say. Number one, you put pressure on your spouse, him or her, to affirm you. And if she or he doesn't affirm you, you have, your identity is undermined. It's not God's love of you, but your spouse's love of you. And that's going to be up and down. Because sometimes your spouse will be unhappy with you. Sometimes your spouse will be very angry, might yell at you. And then if she's the one, or I'm talking about my wife, if she's the one that is the greatest source of love in my life, I'm devastated by that. And I can't even hear her criticisms. I have to defend myself. And another way it works, by the way, is if your spouse dies. I once heard a sermon years ago that I've never said this in it. Well, maybe I have, but because it's almost unfair. I said, if the main person in your life, the main love of your life, the main source of love in your life dies, how is she going to help you when she's laying in a coffin and your heart is breaking? There won't be anybody. The point is, I only love my wife well if I love God more. And so if you have the possibility of a Christian partner who loves God more than you, all I can say, it may be hard from the outside of Christian faith to understand this. I'm trying to explain what it's like from the inside. It's not that easy to understand it. But I'm trying to give you the operating principle. My wife knows when my prayer life gets better, when the spiritual reality of God's love for me becomes more real. She knows that I love her better. She doesn't feel as smothered. She doesn't feel as crushed, but she also doesn't feel abandoned in any way. So I'm just elaborating on what I've already said. I think I'll stop right there. You shouldn't be jealous, is what I'm trying to say, at all. Yeah.
Isn't it very selfish if we love God to try and find satisfaction? How is that really loving God?
Well, I'm very glad you agree with me because I tried to say that and it went by fast. Whenever I get a question of something I said, it's usually because I said it too quickly. And I think I did answer that, but it went by very quickly. Yes, when I was using that illustration that some of you laughed at, so some of you were awake. When I said, if you go to somebody and say, oh, I want to be your friend. Oh, really? Yeah, because that you can help me in my career, you can open doors for me. Frankly, even sex, by the way. I love you because I'm sexually attracted to you, but I really, and I'll feel so incredibly good if somebody as good looking as you sleeps with me. But that's using the person. That's not really loving the person at all. And therefore, yes, if you go to God to make you happy, He won't make you happy. It is selfish to go that way. I actually, in some ways, if you say, I believe in God,
because that's the only way I'll be happy. That makes you a kind of Christian stoic, it's sort of an amalgamation of pagan stoicism and Christianity. It's not real Christianity. So you're totally right, it is selfish. So you should not go to God in order to make you happy. That's why, by the way, this should not be the last. If you're going to hear any of these talks I'm giving, this shouldn't be the last one you hear. Because I'm really not trying to say, oh, if you want to be happy, become a Christian, because that doesn't work that way. Now, admittedly, I would say this, is that, let's be honest, and I think I might have mentioned this the first week, you almost always move toward God initially because of some lack in your own life. So I don't want to be unrealistic. There's almost no way that people ever just say, oh, the most noble thing and the most intellectually rational thing would be if I became a Christian. Usually something is wrong or something is missing. And so you start to explore. So everybody, in a sense, I guess to some degree, starts toward God for somewhat selfish reasons. But what happens I think if you get a grasp on the truth of things, and if you believe what I gave you that little illustration at the end with the czar and the young man and all that, because it's a very good analogy. If you were able to believe that, it starts to work away a lot of the selfish reasons for your relationship to God. You start to love him just for what he's done for you, just for who he is, just for who he is. I'll give you an example of a transformation there. When I was in college, I wanted to get a degree. The only way I could get a degree is if I took a certain number of required courses, and one of them was music appreciation. So in that course, I had to listen to Mozart and then identify Mozart when it was played to get a good grade. So, see, I listened to Mozart in order to get a great grade, in order to get a degree, in order to get a good job, in order to make money. So I listened to Mozart in order to make money. But today, I would be very happy to spend quite a bit of money just to listen to Mozart. Because what happened over the years is Mozart became something that was a good in itself. I found Mozart's music just beautiful in itself, a satisfaction in itself. It's not a means to an end. It's not a way for me to think of myself as being very, very, aesthetically astute. It's not a way for me to get a degree anymore. I love Mozart just for Mozart. And that kind of transformation is what has to happen and does happen for Christians.
Does belief in God, I'll repeat that. Does belief in God, even loving God, necessarily mean you will achieve happiness? Can't you have total belief and still be unhappy?
Well, certainly. I hope you didn't think, for example, if you have a great marriage and you're a Christian and your spouse dies, you're going to go through the grief. You're going to be extraordinarily unhappy, and you're going to be extraordinarily unhappy for a long time. Please do not think I'm saying that even a strong love of God would make you immune to the sorrows of this world. Jesus was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. He was always weeping. I mentioned that last week. And he had a perfect relationship with God, and he was always sorrowful. So please don't think I'm saying that if you have the love of God, you wouldn't experience deep grief. In fact, there's a sense in which you might actually experience more grief, because I found as the longer I've been a Christian, the more I do tend to give. Being a Christian in some ways makes it easier to knit your heart to other people. That's another talk. But in many ways, Christians very often get themselves very involved emotionally with people, and if that's the case, then in some ways you actually experience maybe more grief than if you were a hard, disillusioned person, like the person that C.S. Lewis talked about. But having said all that, even if my spouse dies and I'm filled with incredible grief, the love of God is like salt in the meat. In ancient times, you put salt in the meat in order to keep the meat from going bad. And the joy of my knowledge of the resurrection, the joy of my knowledge of God's love for me and for my spouse, you're weeping as much as anybody. When you're at the coffin, you're weeping as much as anybody. But there's a hope and a love that's, you might say, rubbed in there. So on the other side of the grief, as you start to come out of it, it makes you wiser instead of more bitter. So the answer is, the question is, no, the love of God does not keep you from being extremely sorrowful and extremely unhappy, but it coexists with the unhappiness. So, a happiness that's based on earthly circumstances, like I'm happy because of my career, I'm happy because of my family. A happiness based on an earthly circumstance means that unless things are going well, you'll be happy if they go well. If they don't go well, you'll be sad. Christianity, the sadness of losses coexists with the happiness of Christ's love. And therefore, that's very difficult to understand. There's a kind of background peace rather than background noise in a Christian's life that makes it possible to endure a lot of things. But it certainly doesn't mean that you may not be extremely unhappy. And I did say at the end, I hope that didn't go by too fast, is that the experience you have of God's love in this life is partial. The Bible constantly says the first moment we actually see him face to face, after death, the first moment we actually see him face to face will be transformed by that love because we'll have it fully. But till then, as Paul says, we see in a glass darkly. It's sort of like it's always partial. So all the things I said qualify, but I think still don't undermine the basic strength of the Christian offer.
Several questions about what exactly loving God looks like this question which says, does loving God look different from the way that we would love a person?
There's an awful lot of analogies. Obviously God and human beings are two different things, and God is not visible to us, and that makes a huge difference. So, but there's plenty of analogies. No, I would say there's more similarities than dissimilarities. So, for example, in the very beginning, even though you love your spouse, let's say, or you may not trust your spouse, as the years go by and you start to see the spouse being trustworthy, the love deepens. By the way, another interesting thing is that in the very beginning of a love relationship with a partner, in the very beginning, very often there's an incredible charge the first time you hold hands, or the first time you kiss. And 35 years later into your marriage, probably you're not going to get the same charge when you kiss. Probably not. And you say, oh, isn't that awful? Not really, because the first time you kissed, was that love or was that ego? Was that I'm kissing you and I feel great because I love you, or was it I'm kissing and this person's kissing me back? And it's a charge, but it's more of an ego thing. Like, oh my God, and is that loving the other person, or is that in a way congratulating yourself and sort of like, wow, this person loves me? I would say that even though there's no way I get the same charge from kissing my wife that I did the first couple of times I kissed her. No way, and we would never want to go back to that. Because we look back, we didn't even know who that person. We were more in love with the person than we thought they were instead of the person they were. And we were more in love with the idea of being loved than we were actually sacrificially loving each other. In all those ways, it's the same. You start out, you think you know God and you don't. You think you trust God, but you really don't. You think you know yourself and you don't. In the very beginning, very often, there's a high, oh, I've been forgiven, I like this, but it takes time. In many, many ways, loving God and loving a human being. You also have to have communication. That's what the Bible's about. That's what prayer's about. There has to be interaction. So there's more similarities than dissimilarities.
All right. This person is asking, even if my own life is quite wonderful and I love God out of gratitude, how can I deal with some of the tragedies that are happening in the world? Or how can I ignore the tragedies happening in the world? They say like multiple Holocausts taking place at the same time.
Well, as I mentioned before, I'll come back to it. I think I mentioned it last week. If you go through the New Testament and look up every time that Jesus is said to have an emotion, every reference to Jesus having an emotion, and you put them in categories, you will see the word that's most often used about him is the term that really means to be moved with compassion. But it's a word that doesn't just mean love. It usually means it means sort of empathy or sympathy or a feeling of the person's hurt. And therefore, because Jesus was perfect, he wasn't selfish at all, he was perfect, he was actually more unhappy about the unhappiness of the world. He did not seal off his heart from it. And that's the reason why the Bible says, the Bible says he was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. And why you see him weeping far more than you see him. I mean, there's only one place where we see him kind of laughing and exulting. When he was here, he was always weeping. So, and yet, the reason he was feeling everyone else's sorrow and pain was because he had a perfect love relationship with God. Because that love relationship freed him from his self-absorption so he could feel other people's troubles. You know, as you know, if you are totally self-absorbed, if you're in pain, you don't notice other people being unhappy. Have you noticed that? If you're sick, if you have a cold, if you're miserable, or if there's something else wrong in your life, there might be other people around you unhappy, and you don't even notice. Why? Because you're too self-absorbed. But Jesus, because he had perfect love from God, was not self-absorbed at all, and as a result, he actually did feel the sorrows of the world more than we do. So the idea that I could have a good life and I could have a great relationship with God, but what do I do about all the sorrows of the world? I'll tell you what you do. You cry, just like Jesus did. That's what you do. You don't try to, how can I, ward that off? How can I, guard myself from that? I don't think you should. I don't think you should. So.
How do you explain that there are very happy and content people that do not know Jesus? Would you say that their happiness is fake?
No, of course not. I mean, I don't know that any happiness is fake, by the way. Remember, I talked about levels, and I would say that there's, I would say that it's likely that at some point the happiness and contentment they're feeling right now will wear thin. Because I actually don't think people are different. I think we all have, I believe what Augustine said, that there's deep recesses of the heart. There's a deep cavity down there that only divine love can fill, and nothing in this world can fill. Now, the reality is I doubt very much that a 5-year-old, for example, is aware of that, even though a 5-year-old is a human being. I don't know that 10-year-olds are. So that doesn't mean the cavity's not there. It just means for various reasons they're not aware of it. So no, I wouldn't say it's fake. I would say it's real, but it's certainly not as deep as what you could have. And I hope in some ways, I hope that it will wear thin so that they do look for something deeper, because I think it's the only kind of love that will really get us through things.
This question highlights that you mentioned that C.S. Lewis said, if I find myself longing for something in this world that the world can't meet, then I must belong to another world as a proof that God must exist to meet that need. Mm-hmm. But philosophically, why can't we have longings that can never be met?
I'm sure I said this right. He didn't say that proves. He said it probably means. In fact, I'm going to make sure that I didn't read this wrong. I might have, okay. So a duckling wants to swim, there's such a thing as water. A baby wants to suck, there's such a thing as milk. If I find in myself a longing which this world cannot meet, then it probably means that I was made for another world. Lewis wasn't dumb there.
Close.
He knew that it's not he knew that it's not a demonstrable proof. It's a probability argument, that's all. He's saying, wouldn't it make sense that if you've got desires that cannot be fulfilled, that it's likely, wouldn't that make sense? Or wouldn't the existence of God make sense of that better than any alternative belief system? Now, that's not a proof, because you could say, I have heard people say that evolution produced people that are always unhappy because they're the best people they survived. By the way, I don't know how you prove that. But beyond that, I'm not really sure why always being unhappy and dissatisfied would make you more fit for survival. I don't think it would. So all he's trying to say is Christianity has a really good explanation for that oddity, that idea that most desires have something in reality that fulfills them. Why would I have a desire like this if there wasn't something somewhere that would fulfill it? It was a probability argument. It's a comparison argument. Like, I think I've got a better explanation than yours. It is not a proof. Didn't say that.
This question's a little long, so I'm just going to pare it down, so I hope you don't mind. This person asks, do you think every human being is capable of loving? What about people who are born with medical deficiencies? Would the Christian gospel imply that that person is not actually human because they cannot love God in order to find satisfaction?
Okay, the second part of the question, no way. Now, we're talking about another doctrine of Christianity. I bring this out. Christianity says that human beings are made in the image of God. If you are a human being and you have a child, you're made in the image of God, they're made in the image of God. Now, what does that mean? Well, there's debate about that. It does mean that human beings reflect God in a particular way, but it has always meant in the Bible that anyone in the image of God is infinitely precious and has astounding dignity. So Genesis 9 says, if you kill someone because they're in the image of God, that's a grievous sin. James chapter 1 actually says, I think it's James chapter 1, maybe it's James chapter 3, actually says if you curse someone who's in the image of God, that's a terrible sin. See, what they're saying is the image of God is why you honor someone, an individual, why you treat them as sacred and with dignity, not their capacities. One of the dangers is if you say, well, a person who is mentally retarded isn't a real person because they can't reason. Well, what about your grandmother who starts to get dementia and she can't reason anymore? Does that mean, she's not a person, so we can pull the plug on her? By the way, the secular world right now, and that's another subject which we might get to in 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. The secular world is struggling for a basis for human rights. Why should human beings have more rights than trees? And which human beings have rights? The Christian approach is all human beings are made in the image of God, therefore they're saved because God says so. However, having said that, there are people who, because of the fallenness of creation, there are mental handicaps, there are things that would make a human being incapable of love, because it's a little hard to say that dementia means you're not loving anymore, but some people, as a pastor, I've spent a lot of time with an awful lot of people who had mental decline. And are they loving anymore? Probably not. Are they human beings? Sure. It's very, very sad. And I almost think they need love. If they're human beings, even if they can't love, they still need it. They still need the hugs. They still need the kisses. They still need people to say, I love you. And I think that's true of anyone in the image of God. But yeah, you can be broken enough physically, mentally, that you can't love. But that doesn't mean you're not a human being.
I'm actually getting a lot of questions pointing to the fact that, okay, so then if I love God, then that's what saves us. So I don't think that's what you're trying to say. So I wanted to know if you can address that. Is what you're saying?
Yeah.
Is we love? So
Very
it's
smart.
like, yeah, if we love God enough, then we'll be accepted by Him.
I didn't say that.
Well, yeah, I'm summarizing.
I didn't say, C.S. Lewis didn't say, this proves it. And I didn't say it, but I'm really glad you brought it up because, yeah, of course, the danger here is with that illustration at the very end of the czar and making up the debt, in there, even though I didn't spell it out, the Christian understanding is that we all fall short. Nobody will love God enough from the heart. I even said that already. No matter how hard you try to love God, you'll never love Him like you should. Or put it another way, if it's true that God made you, created you, and if every moment He keeps you alive, if He looked away from you, all your molecules would scatter. You owe Him everything, and you owe to love Him supremely, and you never will love Him supremely. And therefore, if you're saved by loving Him, nobody will be saved. I mean, even though I try to say I struggle to love my God more than I love my wife, the reality is I'm constantly losing that battle and having to get back, or I'm falling off that horse and getting back on the horse. So if you understood me to say, if you love God, that's what saves you, think. Because I tried to say, you never get there. It's always partial. And so if loving God is what saves you, no. It's God's love of you that saves you. That is to say, in Jesus Christ, look, let me cut to something that I probably should put later on. If somebody, let's just say, I borrow your car, if you've got a car. I know you live in New York, so 2 or 3 of you might own a car. So I borrow your car, and I drink while I drive. Please don't tweet this. And I run your car into a wall, and there's $2,000-$3,000 worth of damage. And I come back to you and I say, oh, I'm sorry, it was totally irresponsible, and it was. It's totally irresponsible. Now, there's only 2 things that can happen. You might forgive me and say, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. I don't want to, you don't pay, you don't do it. It's fine. Well, what that means is that you pay the $2,000 to fix the car, or you go without the car. Either way, you bear the cost of my sin, right? Or I could say, no, I'm going to fix your car, and I bear the cost of my sin. But somebody bears the cost of the sin. Do you see that? Even if you say to me, oh, I forgive you, the cost of that doesn't go away. You can only forgive me if you bear the cost. Or I can only make, if you don't forgive me, then I have to bear the cost. So how does God forgive us for the fact that we don't love him as we should? He created us, he sustains us. Nobody loves him the way we owe. We would owe him to love him supremely because we owe him everything, right? So if it's true that we have failed God and that therefore he needs to forgive us for that, how will he do it? He can't just say, I forgive you. Who bears the cost? That's what Jesus did on the cross. It's God coming to earth and bearing it himself. It's a lot like if you said, I forgive you and I don't want your money, I forgive you, but then you bear the cost. That's what Jesus did. Now, that's how you're saved, because you say, I see that Jesus did that, and I put my faith in that, and I ask God to accept me because of that. Now, if you do that, and you realize what he did for you, that evokes love. But the love is the result of the salvation. It's not the means to the salvation. Hear that? It's the result. Have I just proved Christianity? No, I'm just trying to show you how it works.
Okay, so you explained how we are saved, but a couple questions on what exactly do you mean by saved? What does it mean to be saved?
Right now, let's just go with forgiven.
Forgiven.
In other words, your relationship with God is restored because he forgives you. And the relationship with God is what you're built for, without which you'll never have the meaning, you'll never have the identity, you'll never have the life you ought to have. So you've got to have a relationship with God because you were created for it, but the forgiveness is needed.
Thank you for listening today. Gospel in Life's ministry is supported by generous partners all over the world. Your gifts allow us to share the gospel message with millions of people through our podcast, radio, and other channels, including here on YouTube. We're seeing God change lives through the increasing reach of this ministry, so thank you for your part in it. If you'd like to make a gift today, go to gospelinlife.com/YouTube, and we'll send you one of my books as thanks for your gift. Thank you again for your generous support, because